She arrived at the music academy early in the morning, long before most of the students filled the hallways. The building itself was large and elegant, with tall glass windows that reflected the soft light of dawn. Inside, the sound of distant piano practice floated through the air like a gentle echo. Every corner of the place carried the feeling of discipline, talent, and competition. It was the kind of environment where only the best were expected to survive. The young woman walked slowly through the entrance, holding a simple folder close to her chest. She wore plain clothes, nothing fancy or attention-grabbing. Her steps were careful, almost as if she was trying not to disturb the atmosphere around her. People passing by barely noticed her. Those who did glance at her quickly assumed she was just another new student trying her luck in a place that demanded perfection. She did not speak much as she was guided to the main hall for introductions. The hall was already partially filled with instructors and students preparing for the day. Some were tuning instruments, others were discussing advanced compositions, and a few were performing short practice segments to warm up their fingers. The sound of music mixed with quiet conversations created a steady background noise that filled the space with energy. When she stood near the edge of the room, she kept her gaze lowered for a moment. It was not nervousness exactly, but more of an awareness that she was new here and did not yet belong to any circle. The academy was known for producing skilled performers, and many students came from families with strong musical backgrounds. In comparison, she looked like someone who had simply walked in from a different world. An instructor soon approached her. The instructor had a sharp expression, the kind that came from years of working with students who either succeeded or failed under pressure. After briefly checking her registration details, the instructor gave a small nod and motioned her to follow. Without much conversation, she was taken to a practice room. The room was smaller than the main hall but still well equipped. The piano stood in the center, polished and ready. The instructor explained in a calm but firm tone that she would begin with basic exercises. Simple tunes, nothing advanced. It was a standard procedure for new students, especially those without verified performance history. She listened carefully and nodded again. There was no protest, no attempt to explain herself. She simply accepted the instruction as if it was completely normal. The instructor seemed satisfied with her quiet response but also slightly uninterested. In a place filled with ambitious performers, silence was often mistaken for lack of confidence. After leaving her alone in the room, the instructor closed the door. The sound of footsteps faded, and suddenly the space became quiet. She stood there for a moment, looking at the piano. Her reflection faintly appeared on its glossy surface. She slowly walked closer and placed her fingers lightly above the keys without pressing them. For a few seconds, she did nothing. It was as if she was listening to something only she could hear. Not the sound of the room, but something deeper, like a memory or a feeling she carried with her. Her expression remained calm, but there was a slight change in her eyes, something focused and thoughtful. Outside the room, the academy continued its normal rhythm. Students practiced difficult compositions, instructors moved between rooms correcting mistakes, and the sound of music came and went like waves. No one paid attention to the quiet room where she stood alone. In that environment, silence often meant nothing unusual. But inside that silence, she was thinking. She remembered how she had arrived here, not because someone pushed her, but because she had chosen it herself. Music had always been a part of her life, not as something for attention, but as something personal. It was not something she had ever shown openly. In fact, she had spent most of her time avoiding situations where she would be noticed. There had been earlier moments in her life where people had underestimated her. In casual settings, when someone played a tune and others joined in, she would often step back. Not because she could not play, but because she preferred not to reveal too much. She had learned that once people formed an opinion about someone's talent, it was hard to change it. That was one of the reasons she had chosen this academy quietly. She wanted to experience it without expectations, without labels attached to her name. She wanted to see what it felt like to start from the simplest point, even if she was capable of more. The door opened slightly later, and the instructor returned briefly to check on her progress. The instructor expected to hear practice sounds already, maybe a few hesitant attempts at the assigned tune. Instead, the room was still quiet. The instructor looked at her with a slightly questioning expression. She simply said she was ready and placed her hands properly on the piano. There was no explanation, no excuse. The instructor gave a short instruction to begin and then stepped aside. For a moment, nothing happened. Her fingers hovered just above the keys. The silence in the room felt heavier now, as if everyone's expectations had gathered into that single moment. The instructor waited, already assuming this would be a simple and unremarkable performance, something to help her get familiar with basics. Then she pressed the first note. It was soft, controlled, and precise. The sound filled the room gently, not loudly, but clearly. She followed with the next notes, and the simple tune began to form. At first, it sounded exactly like what was expected, something basic and structured, easy for any beginner to perform. But then something subtle began to change. The notes did not remain plain. She started to shape them slightly differently, adding a sense of rhythm that was not written on the page. The timing shifted in a way that made the tune feel more alive. It was still the same composition, but it no longer felt simple. The instructor noticed it almost immediately but did not interrupt. There was something unusual in the way she played, something that did not match the idea of a new student learning a basic exercise. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence, not rushed, not hesitant, but steady and controlled. As the tune continued, more depth began to emerge. The melody carried emotion that was not expected from something so simple. It was as if she was telling a story through the piano, not just playing notes. The room, which had once been just a practice space, started to feel different. Even the instructor's expression changed slightly, shifting from routine observation to careful attention. Still, she did not look up. Her focus remained completely on the piano. Each note flowed into the next without interruption. The simplicity of the assigned piece was no longer visible. It had become something more layered, something that hinted at skill far beyond what had been assumed. And yet, she remained calm throughout, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. The next morning at the academy began like any other day, but something had already changed in the quiet corners of the place. The young woman who had arrived without attention the day before was now part of a small, unspoken curiosity. People had seen her walk into the practice room, but no one had expected anything unusual from her. Yet, somehow, a simple assignment had left behind a feeling that lingered in the air. She returned early again just like before. There was no hurry in her steps, no attempt to draw attention. The hallways were already filling with movement. Students carried music sheets, some discussed techniques, and others practiced finger exercises against the cold surfaces of benches. The academy never stayed still for long. It was always alive with sound and competition. She walked through it all quietly, keeping her folder close. A few students noticed her this time, but their attention did not stay long. In a place where everyone was trying to prove something, it was easy to overlook someone who did not try to stand out. Inside her, however, there was no confusion. She was not here to compete in the way others did. She was here to understand the environment, to observe, and to move at her own pace. That mindset made her different, though nobody fully understood it yet. When she entered the practice area, she saw a few students already seated at pianos. Their fingers moved quickly, playing difficult pieces that required sharp focus and fast coordination. The sound filled the room like a wave of controlled energy. Every mistake was corrected instantly by instructors who walked between stations with strict attention. She chose a quiet corner again. The same piano from the day before was assigned to her. It felt familiar now, as if it had already become part of her small routine. She placed her folder down and stood for a moment, just observing the room. An instructor passed by and paused briefly near her. There was a short glance, a reminder of the previous day's assignment. The instructor gave a simple instruction again, another basic tune, slightly more structured than before, but still meant for beginners. Nothing advanced, nothing that would test deeper skill. She nodded without question, just like before. After the instructor moved away, the room continued its rhythm. Students practiced, corrected mistakes, repeated sections over and over. There was a constant pressure in the air, the kind that existed in places where everyone wanted to improve faster than the rest. She sat at the piano and placed her hands gently on the keys. For a few seconds, she did not play. Her eyes moved slowly across the sheet in front of her, reading every line carefully. But it was not just reading. It was understanding the structure beneath it, the flow hidden inside the simple arrangement. When she finally began, the sound was soft and steady. The notes were correct, simple and clean. It matched exactly what was written. Nothing more, nothing less. To anyone listening casually, it would have sounded like an ordinary practice session. A student following instructions properly. But as time passed, small changes began to appear again. They were not loud changes, not dramatic ones. They were subtle, almost invisible to someone not paying close attention. The timing of certain notes shifted slightly, giving the tune a smoother flow. The pressure on certain keys created a different tone, adding warmth where there was none before. She was not changing the music itself. She was shaping it. Across the room, one of the instructors paused for a moment. It was not because the performance was loud or attention-grabbing, but because something felt different. In a room filled with practice noise, it is often small details that stand out to trained ears. The instructor looked toward her direction again. She was still calm, her posture steady, her focus deep. There was no sign of hesitation or uncertainty. Every movement of her hands was controlled, like someone who understood the instrument far beyond basic training. Nearby students continued their own practice, unaware of what was slowly unfolding in the corner of the room. To them, she was still just a new student doing basic exercises. Nothing more. But for those who paid attention carefully, something was beginning to form. The tune she was playing was no longer just a beginner exercise. It had started to carry a sense of expression that should not have been possible at this level. The melody had depth, almost like it was telling a quiet story without words. Still, she kept her expression unchanged. There was no sign of pride or awareness that she was being noticed. It was as if she was simply doing what felt natural to her. After a while, the instructor who had assigned the piece earlier returned to check progress. The expectation was simple. A beginner would likely still be struggling with timing or would have repeated the same section several times. But as the instructor approached, the sound coming from the piano made them slow down slightly. It was still the same tune, but it no longer sounded like a beginner's attempt. The instructor stopped at a distance and listened. There was no interruption, just observation. The notes were steady, but there was something refined in them, something that did not match the level of instruction given. A slight confusion formed in the instructor's expression. It was not disbelief yet, but curiosity. The kind that appears when something does not match expectation. The young woman continued playing without looking up. Her fingers moved with consistency, never rushing, never falling behind. Each section of the tune flowed into the next without interruption. At one point, she repeated a short passage, but instead of playing it exactly the same way, she introduced a gentle variation. It was subtle enough that someone inexperienced might not notice, but it changed the emotional feel of the piece completely. The instructor noticed that immediately. That was not part of the assigned exercise. Still, nothing was said. The instructor continued watching, now more carefully. Inside the room, the sound of other students faded slightly in awareness, not because they stopped, but because attention naturally shifted. When something unusual happens in a familiar environment, even small changes become noticeable. One student nearby briefly paused their own practice and looked over. Another followed. Slowly, without anyone announcing it, attention began to gather toward the corner of the room. The young woman remained unaware of it, or perhaps she simply chose not to acknowledge it. Her focus stayed on the piano, as if nothing else existed around her. The tune reached a softer section, and here, something unexpected happened. She added emotion, not in a dramatic way but in a controlled and balanced form. The notes became more expressive, carrying a feeling that was difficult to describe. It was no longer just practice. It had become something that felt alive. The instructor's expression shifted again. Now there was no confusion, only realization beginning to form slowly. This was not a beginner, at least not in any ordinary sense. But the question that followed was immediate and unspoken. Why was someone with this level of ability being given such simple assignments? The room continued to fill with quiet attention as the performance carried on, and the answer to that question was still far from clear. The room stayed unusually quiet after that moment. Not because the practice had stopped, but because something in the atmosphere had changed. The sound of other students continued in the background, yet it no longer felt as dominant as before. Attention naturally drifted toward the corner where the young woman was still seated at the piano. She had not finished her piece yet. Her hands remained steady, moving across the keys with the same calm control as before. There was no rush in her movements, no visible awareness that she had become the center of quiet attention. To her, it was still just another exercise, just another assigned tune that needed to be completed properly. But to others watching, it was no longer simple at all. A few students who had originally ignored her now found themselves glancing over more often than they intended. At first, they tried to focus on their own work, but something about the sound kept pulling their attention back. It was not loud or dramatic. It was something else. Something smoother, more refined, something that did not belong in a beginner assignment. The instructor who had first assigned the piece stood closer now, observing without interruption. There was a stillness in their expression, the kind that forms when expectation no longer matches reality. The instructor had seen many students come and go, and had developed a strong sense of what beginners sounded like. What was coming from that piano did not match any of those expectations. The young woman, however, showed no reaction to the growing attention. She continued playing as if she was alone in the room. The sheet in front of her remained open, but she was not depending on it anymore in a strict way. It was as if she had already understood the structure and was now simply expressing it through her own understanding. The tune moved into a slightly more complex section. The transition was subtle, but those who understood music could feel it immediately. The rhythm became more layered, the timing more controlled. There was a softness in the way she shifted between notes, like she was shaping something fragile rather than simply pressing keys. One of the instructors nearby leaned slightly forward without realizing it. It was a natural reaction, something that happens when a performance begins to feel unexpectedly different from what was planned. Still, no one spoke. The room remained in a state of quiet observation. In the background, other students continued practicing, but even they were beginning to lose focus. The sound from her piano was not overpowering theirs, yet it carried a certain presence. It stood out without trying to. At one point, she paused for a fraction of a second between phrases. It was not a mistake. It was intentional. That short silence added weight to the next sequence of notes, making the following part feel deeper, more meaningful. The instructor's eyes narrowed slightly. That small pause was not something taught at beginner level. It showed understanding of timing that usually came from long experience, not early practice. The young woman continued, unaware of the analysis happening around her. Her posture remained straight, her expression unchanged. There was a quiet focus in her face, the kind that comes when someone is fully absorbed in what they are doing. As the piece progressed, something even more noticeable happened. She began to reduce dependence on the sheet music. First, it was small, a glance away from the paper, then another. Slowly, it became clear that she was not reading every note anymore. She was remembering. Or perhaps she was not even remembering in the traditional sense. It was more like she already understood the structure deeply enough that the paper was no longer necessary for each step. This realization spread slowly among those watching. One student whispered something under their breath but stopped quickly, as if unsure whether speaking would break the focus in the room. Another instructor who had just entered the hall paused near the doorway, sensing the shift in attention without knowing its cause yet. The performance continued to evolve. The basic tune, which was meant to test only timing and simple coordination, now carried layers of expression that no one expected. It was still recognizable, but it no longer felt basic. It had become something richer, something that seemed far beyond its original purpose. And yet, she had not changed the sheet music. That was what made it more confusing for those observing. Everything she played was technically within the assignment, but the way she played it created something entirely different. The instructor who had assigned the piece slowly moved a step closer. Their face showed a mix of curiosity and growing uncertainty. It was rare to see a beginner transform a simple exercise into something that felt this developed. Even more rare when there was no prior indication of training at that level. The young woman finally reached a section where the tune repeated earlier patterns. This time she changed it slightly again. Not dramatically, just enough to add depth. A softer touch on certain notes, a slight delay in others, a controlled variation that made the repetition feel intentional rather than mechanical. The room reacted silently. It was not a visible reaction, but a shared understanding among those who noticed. This was no longer repetition. It was interpretation. One of the senior instructors exchanged a brief look with another. No words were spoken, but the expression was enough to show that both had reached the same conclusion. Something unusual was happening, and it deserved attention. Still, no one stopped her. There was a natural hesitation in the room. Interrupting her now felt wrong, as if the performance itself needed to be completed before any judgment could be made. The young woman continued playing. As she moved into the final section of the tune, the atmosphere became even more focused. The sound of other practice sessions faded slightly in awareness. Even though nothing had physically changed in the room, attention had naturally gathered toward her. Her hands moved with steady precision. There was no visible tension, no sign of struggle. Everything flowed smoothly, as if the piano was simply responding to her rather than being controlled by force. The final notes approached, and when they came, they were softer than expected. Not weak, but controlled in a way that made them feel complete. The last note lingered slightly longer than usual, creating a sense of closure that felt intentional. Then silence followed. For a brief moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The young woman lifted her hands away from the keys and remained still, as if waiting for instructions or feedback. She did not look around. She did not react to the silence that had formed. It was as if, for her, the task was simply completed. But for everyone else in the room, something else had happened entirely. The instructor who had first assigned the piece looked at the piano, then at her, then back again, struggling to match what had just been heard with what had been expected. A simple tune had been given, but what they had just heard was something far beyond simple. And at that moment, a new question quietly formed in the minds of everyone watching. Who exactly was she? The silence that followed her performance did not disappear quickly. It stayed in the room like a soft echo that refused to fade. Even though the piano was no longer playing, the memory of the sound still felt present. A few students looked at each other, unsure if they should return to their practice or continue watching her. The usual rhythm of the practice hall had broken, even if no one said it out loud. She remained seated for a moment, her hands resting gently on her lap. Her expression did not change. There was no sign of surprise at the attention she was receiving. It was as if she had simply completed a task that needed to be done. Nothing more. An instructor slowly walked closer to the piano. Their steps were careful, almost uncertain. They looked at the sheet music first, then at the keys and finally at her. There was a slight change in their expression now, something between curiosity and confusion. The assignment on the sheet was simple. Too simple. And yet what had just been performed was not simple at all. The instructor did not speak immediately. They stood there for a few seconds, as if trying to find the right words. The room remained quiet, except for the faint sounds of other students still practicing in the background, though even those sounds felt distant now. Finally, the instructor asked her to play the same piece again. It was not a request of doubt, but of confirmation. She nodded without hesitation. There was no frustration in her response. No pride either. Just acceptance. She adjusted her position slightly and placed her hands back on the piano. The sheet music remained in front of her, unchanged. The room again began to focus on her, though this time with more attention than before. When she began to play again, the first few notes were exactly the same as before. Simple, clean, controlled. But now people were watching more closely. They noticed things they had missed earlier. The way she shaped the beginning of each phrase. The way she controlled the space between notes. The way she made even the simplest parts feel intentional. It was no longer just sound. It was structure. As she continued, the instructor stepped slightly to the side, observing from a different angle. Another instructor nearby also started to pay attention. Slowly, more eyes turned toward her. The tune followed its expected pattern, but she continued to do something subtle with it. She was not changing the composition itself. She was refining it as she played. Small adjustments in timing. Slight emphasis on certain notes. Gentle pauses that added weight where none was written. To someone inexperienced, it might have still sounded like a simple beginner exercise. But to trained ears, it was becoming clear that something unusual was happening. One of the instructors frowned slightly, not in disapproval, but in deep focus. They leaned a little closer, listening carefully. The young woman remained calm. There was no change in her expression. No sign that she was aware of the attention growing around her. She played as if she was alone in the room, even though she was no longer alone. The melody moved into its middle section. Here, something more noticeable happened. She introduced a variation. It was not large or dramatic. It was subtle, almost invisible unless someone was paying close attention. But it changed the emotional tone of the piece completely. The simple tune, which had originally sounded flat and instructional, now carried depth. It felt more expressive, almost like it had a hidden layer that was being uncovered. An instructor finally spoke softly to another nearby. There was no excitement in the voice, only realization beginning to form. This was not accidental. The changes were controlled, repeated, intentional. The young woman continued without interruption. Her fingers moved with steady confidence. There was no hesitation in her playing, no correction, no uncertainty. Everything felt natural to her, as if this was the most normal way to play. A few students in the room had now completely stopped practicing. They were watching openly. Some of them looked surprised. Others looked confused. A few simply observed in silence, trying to understand what made her performance feel different from theirs. The instructor who had first assigned the piece slowly moved closer again. This time, their expression had changed fully. The confusion was gone. Now there was something closer to realization. They were not just hearing a student play a basic tune anymore. They were hearing someone transform it into something far beyond its intended level. The performance continued. As she approached the later section of the piece, her control became even more noticeable. The transitions between notes were smoother. The rhythm felt more balanced. The sound carried a quiet strength that did not come from speed or force, but from precision. Every note felt placed with intention. The room itself seemed quieter now, even though nothing had physically changed. It was the kind of silence that happens when attention becomes fully focused on one point. She did not look at anyone. She did not check for reactions. She simply continued playing. At one point, she slightly slowed down the tempo for a short phrase. It was a small change, but it created a moment of emotional weight that was not present in the original composition. An instructor's eyes widened slightly. That was not written. And yet it worked. Perfectly. The young woman continued to the final section. Now, the simplicity of the tune was no longer visible at all. It had been reshaped into something expressive and controlled. It still followed the original structure, but it felt like a completely different experience. As she reached the final notes, she softened her touch even more. The ending was gentle, controlled, and precise. The last note faded into silence. This time, no one reacted immediately. The room stayed still. Even the students who had been watching seemed unsure of how to respond. It was not confusion anymore. It was something closer to disbelief mixed with thought. The instructor finally stepped forward fully. They looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Their voice was calm, but there was a clear shift in tone now. The way they addressed her was different from before. More careful, more respectful. They asked if she had truly been given only basic training before coming here. She paused for a moment, then answered simply, "Yes." That single word made the instructors exchange another look. because what they had just witnessed did not match that answer at all. The young woman stood up slowly, adjusting her posture. She looked at the piano once more, then stepped slightly back from it. She did not ask questions. She did not show confusion. She simply waited. And in that moment, the instructors realized something important was beginning to form in their minds. This was no longer just about a simple tune. It was about a talent that had not been understood yet. The silence in the practice hall did not end quickly. It stretched longer than usual, as if the room itself was trying to understand what had just happened. The final note of her performance still seemed to linger in people's minds even after the sound had disappeared. No one returned immediately to their own practice. Even the soft background noise of other pianos felt distant now. The young woman remained seated for a moment after finishing. Her hands rested gently on her lap. She did not look around, and she did not appear to be waiting for praise or reaction. It was as if, for her, the task had simply been completed and nothing more needed to be added. But the people around her were not in the same state. One of the instructors finally broke the silence by taking a slow step forward. Their expression was no longer neutral. There was clear focus now, mixed with uncertainty and curiosity. The instructor looked at the piano first, then at the sheet music and finally at her. The sheet music was still simple, almost too simple for what had just been played. That contradiction made everything more difficult to understand. Another instructor approached quietly from the side. Without speaking, they leaned slightly to look at the same sheet. There was a brief pause between them, a silent exchange of thoughts that did not need words. Both seemed to be processing the same confusion. The performance they had just heard did not match the assignment given. It was not just slightly better. It was something that felt entirely different in quality, control, and expression. The young woman finally stood up from the piano bench. She adjusted her posture calmly, as if nothing unusual had taken place. Her movements were natural, unhurried, and quiet. She closed the sheet music gently and placed it back on the stand. Only then did she glance up briefly. That small moment of eye contact was enough to make the instructors pause again. There was no arrogance in her expression. No pride. No expectation. Only calmness, as if she was simply waiting for the next instruction like any other student. But the instructors were no longer seeing her as any other student. One of them finally spoke in a careful tone. The question was simple at first. Something about her background, her training, where she had learned to play like that. It was asked in a way that tried to remain professional, but the curiosity behind it was obvious. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Her voice was soft and steady. She explained that she had learned music over time, mostly on her own, without formal recognition. She did not give dramatic details, nor did she try to make her answer sound impressive. It was brief, almost too simple compared to the question being asked. The instructors exchanged another look. Self-taught musicians were not unheard of, but what had just been performed did not match casual self-learning. The level of control, the awareness of timing, and the emotional depth in a basic piece suggested something far more structured. Still, no one pressed further immediately. Instead, the instructor gently asked her to remain for a moment longer. There was another small task they wanted her to try. Not as a test, but as a way to understand her abilities more clearly. She nodded without hesitation. A few nearby students who had been quietly observing began to shift their attention fully toward her now. The earlier practice in the room had almost stopped. Even those who tried to continue found themselves distracted. The instructor walked to a nearby shelf and selected another sheet of music. This one was slightly more complex than the previous one. Not advanced, but enough to require more control and understanding of structure. It was placed in front of her without explanation beyond a simple instruction to try it. She looked at it carefully. For a longer time this time, she studied the notes. Her eyes moved slowly across the page, as if she was not just reading the notes but understanding how they connected. The room remained quiet again during this moment. Even the smallest sounds felt noticeable. Then she sat down. She placed her hands on the piano again, but did not begin immediately. There was a brief pause. Not hesitation, but preparation. And then she started. The first few notes were correct and steady, familiar enough for the instructors to relax slightly. It matched expectations at the beginning, but just like before, something subtle began to shift as the piece continued. The melody was no longer just being played. It was being shaped again. But this time, the difference was more noticeable earlier. She handled the transitions between sections with a level of smoothness that made the structure feel almost effortless. Where most students would show small breaks or uncertainty, she created continuous flow. The music felt connected in a way that made it difficult to separate one part from another. The instructors watched closely now. This was no longer a surprise. It was confirmation. One of them moved slightly closer, standing just behind her at a respectful distance. They were observing not just the sound, but the way she interacted with the instrument itself. Her fingers did not show tension. Her posture was stable. Every movement was controlled but natural. It did not look like struggle. It looked like familiarity at a deep level. As she reached the middle section of the piece, she made another small adjustment. It was similar to before, but even more refined this time. A slight variation in rhythm. A gentle emphasis on certain notes that brought out a hidden layer in the composition. It was not written in the sheet. It was added through understanding. One of the instructors finally whispered, almost unintentionally, that this was far beyond expected level. No one responded. The performance continued. The room, which had once been filled with multiple sounds, was now mostly centered around her. Even those who were not directly watching could feel the shift in focus. It was not forced. It happened naturally. The young woman remained completely calm. There was no change in her expression, no sign that she was aware of the growing attention. She continued playing as if she was alone, following the music as it unfolded. As she approached the final section, she reduced the intensity slightly. The sound became softer, more controlled, as if she was guiding the piece toward closure rather than ending it abruptly. The final notes arrived gently, and then silence returned again. This time it was heavier, not uncomfortable, but full of thought. The instructors did not speak immediately. They simply stood there, looking at her and then at the piano. The second performance had removed any remaining doubt. What they were witnessing was not ordinary beginner skill. It was something that had been hidden, either intentionally or simply never revealed in the right environment. The young woman slowly stood up again, her expression unchanged. She stepped back slightly from the piano, waiting quietly. And in that moment, the instructors realized something else was beginning to form in their minds. This was no longer just about talent. It was about why someone with this level of ability had entered the academy without ever showing it before. The room stayed quiet even after she stepped away from the piano. It was not the kind of silence that came from nothing happening. It was the kind that comes after something unexpected, when people are still trying to understand what they just experienced. A few students slowly returned to their own instruments, but their focus was broken. Their fingers moved, but their attention kept drifting back to the corner where she stood. The instructors gathered near the front of the room, speaking in low voices. They were careful not to make it obvious, but it was clear they were discussing her. Their expressions were serious, not excited in a casual way, but thoughtful. There was something unusual about her case that they could not ignore anymore. She, however, stood quietly near the piano, waiting without any sign of discomfort. Her hands rested naturally by her side. She did not look nervous, nor did she seem proud. It was as if everything that had just happened belonged to a completely normal day. One of the instructors finally approached her again. This time, the tone was different. Not strict, not casual, but careful. There was respect in the voice now, mixed with curiosity. The instructor asked if she had ever performed in front of an audience before or participated in formal competitions. She paused for a moment before answering. Her response was simple. She said she had mostly played in private settings and had not taken part in formal events. She explained it without adding any emotion, almost like she was describing something ordinary. That answer made the instructors even more uncertain. A talent like that, hidden or unused in formal environments, was rare. It raised more questions than it answered. One of the instructors looked at the others, silently suggesting that something did not add up. But they did not push her further. Instead, they asked her to wait while they discussed something among themselves. She nodded and stepped slightly aside, standing near a window where soft light entered the room. She looked outside briefly. There was no sign of impatience, no attempt to leave or ask questions. She simply waited. Behind her, the instructors continued their quiet discussion. Some believed she had received strong private training. Others thought she might have been exposed to advanced learning without formal recognition. A few were simply unsure how to explain what they had heard. What they all agreed on, however, was that her ability was far beyond what had been assumed at first glance. After a few minutes, one instructor returned. They told her that they would like her to continue practicing at the academy, but under closer observation. Not as a restriction, but as a way to understand her abilities better and guide her properly. She listened carefully and gave a small nod. There was no resistance, no visible emotion, just acceptance. This calm response made the instructors pause again. Most students in her position would have asked questions, shown excitement, or tried to explain themselves further. But she remained steady, as if she had already expected this outcome. The instructor then offered her access to more advanced practice rooms. For the first time, her expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to show attention. She accepted the offer quietly. Later that day, she was guided to a different section of the academy. The environment here was different. The rooms were larger, the instruments better maintained, and the atmosphere more focused. Fewer students were present, and those who were there were clearly more experienced. The sound of practice pieces here was more complex, more demanding. She walked through it without hesitation. People noticed her again. Some students glanced at her briefly, curious about a new face entering this section. But no one spoke to her directly. She remained an unfamiliar presence in a place where most people already knew each other. She was shown to a private practice room. This room had better acoustics, a higher quality piano, and a more serious atmosphere. It was clear that this space was meant for focused training, not casual learning. The instructor who brought her here explained that she could use this room for her practice from now on. After the instructor left, she stood alone in the room. For a moment, she did not move. She looked at the piano, then at the chair, then around the room. It was not excitement that filled her expression. It was observation. She was taking in the space carefully, as if adjusting to a new environment. Then she sat down. She placed her hands on the keys, but did not play immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly. In that short moment of silence, it felt like she was reconnecting with something inside herself. Not memories, not thoughts, but something deeper connected to sound itself. When she opened her eyes again, she began to play. This time there was no assigned simple tune. She chose to play something on her own. The first notes were soft, but immediately different from anything she had played before. There was more freedom in her expression now. The structure was not rigid. It flowed in a way that felt natural, almost like she was speaking through music rather than following instructions. The sound filled the private room completely. Outside, the academy continued its normal rhythm. Students moved between classes, instructors corrected performances, and practice sessions carried on as usual. But in that small room, something separate was unfolding. Her music grew gradually in complexity. Not in a way that felt forced, but in a way that developed naturally, like a thought expanding. Each section connected smoothly to the next. There were moments of softness followed by stronger emotional depth, all balanced with control. She was no longer just playing notes. She was expressing something that could not be easily written down. Instructors who passed nearby occasionally slowed down, sensing something unusual coming from the room. A few paused briefly outside but did not enter. There was a quiet understanding that what was happening inside was something personal, something being observed rather than interrupted. Inside the room, she remained focused. Her posture stayed steady. Her movements were smooth. There was no visible strain, no hesitation. It was as if the piano responded to her thoughts directly. As the piece reached its middle section, the intensity increased slightly. The rhythm became more layered, but still controlled. Carried emotion, but not in a chaotic way. Everything remained balanced. Then, just as before, she introduced subtle variation. A change in timing. A shift in tone. A gentle emphasis that transformed the feeling of the piece without breaking its structure. It was small but meaningful, and it revealed something important. This was not random talent. This was understanding. Deep understanding of how music could be shaped, not just played. When she finally reached the end of the piece, she slowed down gradually. The final notes were soft and steady, fading naturally into silence. She removed her hands from the keys and sat still for a moment. There was no applause, no audience, just silence again. But this time it felt different. Not confusion, but recognition beginning to form in the quiet corners of the academy. The instructors outside had already started to understand something clearly. She was not someone who had suddenly become talented. She was someone who had always been capable. And now, the real question was no longer about what she could do. It was about why she had chosen to hide it until now.